Welcome to a new series of the Dissidents Podcast with your co-hosts Jennifer Richmond and Brandy Shufutinsky. In this series, we explore the radical roots of liberated ethnic studies, how extreme ideology is infiltrating our schools, and the aim to indoctrinate instead of educate, and our search for solutions to empower parents, teachers, and students, giving them the tools to embrace inquiry and to express their individuality.
Carob Marcelle, it is so good to have you on our Dissidents Podcast, the series of our Dissidents Podcast that we call the Radical Roots of Ethnic Studies. I'm running solo today, Jennifer Richmond, without my co-host Brandy Shufutinsky. But Carob, you and I spoke a little bit before, and your story of Utah was so outrageous. I just knew that you had to tell it online here. And let me, just before I give it over to you, one of the things that we look at a lot with ethnic studies, and a lot of what we see is happening in California. And although our focus is national, the liberated ethnic studies, I need to always clarify that because there is, some, well, personally, I think we should do away with anything with studies altogether, but that's a different story. But there are some good forms of ethnic study, but it's so much as focus is on California. And that, because that's kind of where it started, right? California, Washington, that area. But your stories of Utah and the work that you've done in Utah and your own background, who you are as a parent, as a mom, as a, advocate, I'm going to stop. Just start. Tell us who you are, how this got started. And then, I'll jump in with questions, but tell us what's going on in Utah.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I actually moved here from Seattle, and my hope was to seek refuge, to put my head in the sand, and to never have to think about the crazy again. And then I get to Utah, and when I'm here, the first thing that I do is I go to the schools, and they have these beautiful patriotic murals on the walls. And so I'm thinking, okay, this is fine. And then I scheduled a tour. And there was no teacher or administrative person to give me a tour. They sent me with some kids, so I couldn't have any questions asked. And then I realized, oh, you have no honors classes anywhere. So luckily, I managed to find a wonderful charter school. Very what we went to school with, but also with a focus. Their focus is on merit and patriotism. So it's beautiful. But I knew that it ended in ninth grade. After ninth grade, you had there was nothing left, because I'm in a small town, and it was a small charter school, K through 9. So the first thing that happened is I got here right when they were kind of debating whether or not to allow critical race theory in Utah or to ban it. And I saw our governor say, well, we're not going to ban critical race theory. I mean, we're not going to let people talk about oppressed or oppressor, but we want to make sure true history is taught. And at that moment, I realized, oh, crap. I ran away. We sold our home. We started all over again to be in the exact same mess. And so the first thing that I did was I reached out to a parent group. It's called Utah Parents United. And I said, can I teach? Can I just hold a class and teach teenagers what's going on and what they can expect coming in their schools? And they said, yes, please. And that started somebody saw that and said, will you speak at this event? Will you do this? Whatever. And so I did. And I started speaking about what I call critical resentment theory.
Ooh,
because that's what it ultimately does. I don't have the argument with people whether or not critical race theory is in our schools. It is, but they will say it's a college level praxis and it would never happen in elementary schools. I'm sorry, but Christine Sleater openly says that ethnic studies, liberated ethnic studies, when guided by critical race theory, is taking things in the right direction. She openly says that. You can watch it on YouTube.
Wow.
So Utah Parents United saw in me something, and they decided to make me a community leader. So I just opened up a Facebook page, and originally I started with 6 people, and even with those 6 people, I got people telling me I didn't know what I was talking about. It would never be here. And now it's like 516 people. So it's not huge, but in my community, that's pretty significant. So the things that I've seen are my middle school teaching that Ebonics is the official language of African Americans.
That is officially being taught.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was one class that a teacher taught. Mostly what we have here is a lot of focus on GSA, a lot of focus on gay, not stabilization. People think it's stabilization, but it's activism. So teaching our children to be activists. And thankfully, just in the last in the last month, with all the horror that's happening worldwide, people are starting to go, where's this coming from?
Right.
And when you say, yeah, it's not TikTok, my friends.
Right.
So let me show you. And I have teachers who send me things. I have so many parents, and I have students who tell me their stories because I work at a homeschool co-op, and I teach kids the values of liberty and how to protect it. I teach them what wokeism is, and I make it very relevant to where they're at right now. And I do the same thing on my parent group. So I've had people come and try to close me down. She doesn't even have a child in the public school system. And I was like, I'm so glad that you said that. Actually, my child is starting public school. He's already enrolled. So because he takes only 2 classes. I don't want to say the 2 classes, but he takes only 2 classes. And I made sure that these classes were ones that had virtually no possibility of being woke, even if the teacher is, the subject matter cannot go down that direction.
Well, I mean, and tell us a little. You escaped from Washington to Utah, and for most of our listeners, I think it's kind of assumed that Utah would have been more red or more conservative, or a little less. Give us some history of how Utah, this critical race theory, this liberated ethnic studies, how it kind of made its way into Utah specifically.
Sure. Utah is a very religious state. With religion, for good or bad, comes obedience and also a desire to be kind. So that desire to be kind, you can kind yourself to death. You can kind yourself. You can go, oh, I want everybody to think I'm nice. So what's going on in Utah is the LGBTQIA agenda very heavily. There are more intersectionality flags than there are pictures of Christ at Brigham Young University. There are teachers currently being told that if they do not gender bend, they cannot graduate.
And would you told me this in our call, would you tell our listeners what that means? Because to me, I didn't really know what you were talking about until you laid it out. So when you say gender bend, lay it out for us.
Wear a dress for 2 weeks if you're a man, paint your fingernails, and attend support groups. Now you have to understand, Utah is very divided between people who follow that old Book of Mormon values, traditions, standards. I'm not even Mormon, but I know the history. I'm former, and I know the history, and I don't speak disparagingly about it. So, what it says in those books and in the teachings and from the pulpit and what the people are doing are 2 very different things. My personal opinion is that in 2008, when they stood for the Marriage Act, a bunch of Californians said, oh, really? We'll show you. And they moved here. So it's very much changing the culture. But the worst thing that's happening in our culture isn't even race. That's bad. It's really, really bad. We have a 16% proficiency rate for reading in this, in our state, and our math is not any better. So we have really terrible outcomes. There are rubrics. I saw one the other day that made me cry, a teacher's rubric on how they teach that says, how many times did you mention the child's race or think about the child's race if they were being punished for something? So a teacher actually has to write down their internalized bias. They have to do the work if a child gets in trouble in their class. It's a lot. There's a lot of kind of struggle sessions. There's a lot of all of that. But the crazy thing that's here is mental health. So everything is focused on your child's mental health. Our governor visits the schools and talks to the kids about mental health. Meanwhile, the GSA kids wore armbands so that they looked like victims, an armband to show who was a member of the GSA. And when I mean armbands, I mean like the Nazi bands on their arms. And I don't know. Some people will say our governor is complicit. Some people will say he's naive. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I do know that people have attempted to speak. When I got here, the first thing that I did was went to my schools. I was like super volunteer mom. So I lived at the school. I was a volunteer school librarian. I taught reading. I taught the drama club. So people loved me. And then all of a sudden, immediately it became, oh, here's a pie. We're sorry about George Floyd. And I was like, wait a second. That's all I am, is just the shade of my skin. That's it. And that's why we decided to move when they sent out a paper and said biracial children should identify as their oppressed side. So not to run around in circles. Like I said, I just chugged some coffee. So,
but yeah, that's when you left Washington. So the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was when your biracial child was told that they must identify with their white side, their oppressor side. No, I'm sorry, opposite. That they identify with their black side, their oppressed side, that they must identify with that. Okay, that's interesting because I've seen also the opposite, where kids who are biracial who present as as whiter skin are told they must, because of the way they look, they must identify with as the oppressor.
So the privilege will never stop. I was interviewing a young woman who was a beauty queen, a literal beauty queen. And she told me, she got sassy for a moment and she goes, well, do you believe that you have more privilege than me because you're lighter skinned than I am? And I looked at her and I said, I would say that yes, in certain circles, that's a true thing. But I said, in other circles, they literally roll out the red carpet for you. You're a beauty queen with like the crown and the flowers. And so everyone has some sort of privilege. But that shouldn't limit you, or the opposite of limit you. I cannot think of what that word would be right now, but you are the sum of all your parts. And people will say, well, that means you believe in intersectionality. And no, I don't, because I believe that merit and your hard work and the choices that you make outweigh all of the stuff that makes up you.
This is a kind of a random question, but I've been talking about this and I'll explain myself in a minute. But the armbands, well, first of all, GSA, that stands for?
This is an interesting one. It used to stand for Gay Straight Alliance, but now there are so many people who have allied that they have become part of the queer community. So now it stands for Gender and Sexualities Alliance.
See, that is interesting. I'm glad I asked. I kind of put like gay student, activist or gay student alliance. So I'm glad I asked. I hadn't heard that before. Okay, so it's changed from Gay Straight Alliance to
Gender and Sexualities
Alliance. Interesting. Okay.
And so can I? Okay, sorry. The most alarming thing I found out about this was that when the certain event that we can't go into details happened in Tennessee. Okay. That same day, kids who are part of GSA got a text. They are too young to vote, but they were told to go outside and protest and to there's a giant list on the gender and sexualities. What is it called? I want to say it's the Gender Sexualities Alliance website. And it's a list, and you go down to the bottom and it says it came from DC, and it's a political list. Protest until trans kids can use the bathrooms. Protest until we have all the rights that we demand. And you're just looking at this list going, you're using our children as pawns.
Oh my God. Yeah, your story is coming out of Utah. Like I said, shocked me. I want to go back to, I want to go there, but I want to go back to something because I might forget. So with the armbands that you were mentioning, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. It's going to seem a bit oddball, but what color were they?
Rainbow.
Okay. So the reason I asked that, just, I've been talking to a lot of people, and we can get into this as well. A lot of these various let's call them critical social justice. So not just the race theory, like you said, it's gender theory, et cetera. So we'll kind of lump it all together, if you will, into critical social justice. A lot of it has this neo-Marxist undertones. And so a lot of stuff that we're seeing with regards to liberated ethnic studies and with regards to other movements have got this kind of red and black color to it, which is very similar to, communist revolutions.
Yes.
All over the world. And so we find that, I mean, the imagery, and again, this is part of what we're trying to do in both this podcast and in our work, is just educate people around these nuances. Are so little, but if you don't pick up on them, it might be too late, where like the influence has gotten so big that it's too late. It's now that you need to realize this. So I asked about the armbands because we were seeing this influx of flags, and all this stuff that has got this red and black imagery, which is the communist Marxist.
Absolutely. So in Salt Lake, I was going to a restaurant with my husband, and on the ground, somebody had dropped a flyer, and that flyer was an armed queer group. And that was red and black. And it said, "Take no prisoners." I mean, it looked like a terrorist, and they're passing it out like this is normal.
So, okay, then this takes us back to where we were, what you were saying, that the GSA received this text and they were telling to go out and protest. I mean, this is where I also want to go. We're teaching our kids, I mean, education, you'd already mentioned it's dismal, what's going on in Utah. And a part of it is we're not teaching our kids, the 3 R's anymore. We're teaching them I guess there might be new R's. We're teaching them how to be revolutionaries around race. We'll pick another R out there. But, I think that's part of the big problem as well, is that our kids aren't, the whole dynamics of education have changed.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why you left
Washington. And what I found in what I do for my class is Socratic. We have Socratic discussions. And so they come up with the question. So the last question that we had was, what is nationalism anyway? And we dug into what is nationalism, for good or for bad. And all I do is foster questions and let them come to their conclusions. And then we open up. And so the definition for nationalism is someone who loves their country to the detriment of another. So you hear that, and the first thing you think is, well, that's not good. And then we say, but then you start asking the questions. What does detriment mean? What are the goals? What do we need to, what is the opposite of being pro your country? Okay, let's look at the United Nations. What are their goals? And then you start looking at their sustainability goals. And you go, that's interesting, because I don't necessarily think that a country it's their detriment if their strong education system is turned into a global education system that teaches them how to be pawns, that strips their high academics or strips their religious beliefs and says instead you have to believe in infinite number of genders.
You said that you teach, you were asked to come in and teach it, kids about this current moment, what they're seeing, to be aware of all the things that we're talking about now. What do you think in your teaching, because that's what we're trying to find, the place where we can actually have this conversation, where we can make an impact. And we're so polarized, it's so hard to do that. But where did you, in the way you were talking to students, what hit home? What landed?
Well, I can tell you the way that I got the job, how I got offered it. I go around the state telling the story of Harriet Tubman. I dress up as her and I do these reenactments. And I am not I'm careful in that I want no one to take on guilt that's not theirs. But I don't hide the terror of her story. But I also don't hide the faith or the resilience that she has.
Right.
And so what happened was I was performing this at multiple camps. Then I performed it at the Capitol, and a liberal teacher, you'll know why in a moment because I didn't ask her, she walked up to me and she goes, "Would you come to my school and perform this?" And I said, I'd be happy to. And she said, "Because those conservatives don't want history taught." I am very quickly becoming one of the more prominent voices for Black conservative Utah. This woman doesn't understand that because she's so blinded. And I did say, "Are you sure? Are you sure it's not that they don't want the 1619 project taught? Because that's different than teaching a true version of history. When you're teaching revisionist history, I think that's what people said, no. They don't want it taught at all. We're afraid to teach." And that's what they're told. But I don't believe that that's the truth. So I have met with Bob Woodson and his organization, the Woodson Project. I've taught 1776 Unites classes for UPU. People are hungry for the truth, but they're also hungry to not be shamed. Activist teachers are coming into our classrooms and they are teaching our kids a very biased version of history. And it's almost sadistic in that desire to teach them the worst parts of this country, but not to teach them the beauty. So I was speaking at an ethnic studies meeting at the Capitol, and I said, absolutely teach them about marches, absolutely teach them about sit-ins, but don't forget that there were white people sitting next to the Black people in those sit-ins. Don't forget that white people were used as human shields. These things happened because people even back then believed it was wrong. And also do not teach them that the 1960s is today, because it's not. And so between that and also being the shade I am, I don't know if people will listen to this or watch it, but I am Black. I'm biracial, but people, especially in Utah, tend to think, well, that just means Black, which is its own
story.
And the other thing is that I don't go in with a chip on my shoulder. Even if somebody has their opinions about African Americans, I look at bigotry and racism differently. To me, bigotry is stemmed out of ignorance. So to me, it doesn't have that malicious hatred behind it that racism does. And bigotry is something that a person can go, "Oh, I didn't understand that. I mean, my God, I didn't know about Black Wall Street. I didn't know that there were successful African Americans who were lawyers and doctors. Literally until my 30s, I didn't know those things. I remember I had a friend who was very wealthy, and she asked me if I would drop her off at her uncle's in Bellevue, Washington. First, I was shocked that any Black people lived in Bellevue. And then we get there and we drive up to this enormous house, and I flat out asked my friend, is your uncle a singer or an athlete?" So I can't judge somebody for not knowing, because I didn't know, because that's how schools are designed. Schools are designed to say that Black people are poor.
This is so, I'm going to, it's not a shameless plug, but I'm going to plug the book that we wrote, Letters in Black and White, with my co-author, Wink Twyman. I mean, that is that was his take. And that's really where our conversation started. And it started around these ideas of, one of the funny stories from there is I said, well, as a white person, I never lived in the ghetto, so I can't relate. And he was like, I never lived in the ghetto. Like, why do you assume? And so, and we talk about this in the book, and the book goes on and talks about a lot of the stuff that you've just mentioned about resilience. I mean, we talk about slavery. Let's talk about it. Let's lay it out. Let's also talk about Black Wall Street. Let's also talk about John Marshall Langston. Let's talk about George Boyer Vajon. That's, the premise of our book. So let's talk about it all. But we kind of try to bust some of these myths that I think are the most damaging. And when you talk about bigotry and racism, I think those myths are perpetuating, racism.
Yes.
And so we talk about the difference between racism and bigotry in our book too. I'm getting excited. Like I said, I don't want to do a shameless plug, but this is I spent years writing this, and it's so nice to speak with people and go, clearly with me, we've got different skin colors, but this is so important to me that we have this conversation and we do it right. I will tell you though, Carob, that I've kind of transitioned recently, in the past, I'd say 6 months or so, after the book came out, everything was focused on race. But now, and this goes back to something we mentioned earlier, what my biggest fear is being, originally coming to this conversation originally as a China scholar, is the neo-Marxism, because I see that as the underlining, that is what is, undergirding all the talk about race, all the talk about gender. And that, to me, what's really, really scary. That is, race is being manipulated, gender is being manipulated.
Yeah.
Again, I think probably like you, I don't care Black, white, I don't care gay, trans, whatever. I don't. What I care about is how we're having the conversation.
Yes. So that's the other thing that I do, is I talk to people who've escaped communism, who love this country. And the interesting thing about that is that there was a time when I never would have had conversations with Asians. And not because I have an issue, but because I've always felt honestly, there's a huge Black people and other people don't like each other kind of thing. And I'm not that person. And the reason I'm not that person is because I grew up in foster care with so many different people. I lived in 18 homes in 9 years. And so I see people for who they are. So that does not mean I'm colorblind. That's not a true thing, unless you're literally,
right,
you can't
right. Unless you literally,
but it means it doesn't matter to me. I care about your soul. I care about who you are as a human being. But what I've done is I've been able to reach out and listen to their stories, and they're desperate to tell them, because everything they ran away from is, I don't even know if it's on our front doors anymore. I feel like it is standing in our living room, taking a look around. That's where we're at right now.
It's taking a seat at the table, even.
Yes.
Arguably.
Yes. And so one of the things that my biggest focus is K-12. Also, what's happening in the universities is insane. It does look like a cultural revolution. Probably the most concerning of all of it is social and emotional learning, which is just a twin of ethnic studies. When you go to Castle and you start looking at stuff, you're like, oh my gosh, they just cut and pasted it and put it into both of them. And then you start thinking, okay, and then they want these entwined. They don't want your social and emotional learning class that you can opt out of. They want it throughout the day. They don't want your ethnic studies that you can opt out of. They want it in absolutely everything, woven in. So
everything.
When you're doing math, it's not the train was going this fast. It's Jamal plays basketball at this speed, and that's not great. It's not great. I'm afraid of a ball. So I'm careful not to say balls, because you know where that goes.
Well, I think that one of the things is, and again, goes back to the neo-Marxism, which I think I've become more interested in than really the talk about race or gender,
Yes.
specifically, more generalized, because I think some of us are missing, and myself included, we're missing that in the specifics of critical race theory, in the specifics of gender theory. And it really has started with, and Brandy and I have talked about this before, with Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yes.
And that is the underlining framework and paradigm and book that teachers are taking with them. I think we can see it most clearly in ethnic studies, because there's just so much there that we can say, that we can point to. But you're right, it's so much more than just ethnic studies. I mean, it is really running the gamut.
Well, in fact, I heard about Pedagogy of the Oppressed when I was standing outside of the Utah School Board building, and a teacher walked up to me and said, "Have you even read this? Have you read this? I think it'll change your life." And I said, "I grew up in foster care. I aged out. I think I know what my level of oppression is. I'm good, thank you." I don't believe it's beneficial to teach people to look at the worst parts, true or not. I don't believe that is beneficial. And I also don't necessarily think it is true. I don't know if you've seen, I'm sure you have, the mandala, I call it the mandala of intersectionality. There are so many things on it. It's like 200 things that you're supposed to circle which ones you have. Do your parents have a car? Are your parents married? Do you have a house with more than one floor? Do you live in an apartment? Then your kids are like, "Oh, this looks fun. Look at this big coloring thing." And they're circling all of the ones that they are. And then they're made a list. This one says you're privileged. This one says you're not. How privileged are you in the room compared to the other kids? This is no different than, I believe, in Korea. I always mix up North and South. Which one is horrid? South, right? North Korea. Okay. So North Korea, where they don't speak to each other because you are divided so minutely. Okay. And this I've heard from people who live there. You're divided so minutely. In China, and under Mao, it was the red class and the black class. And then between them, it's like rich landowner, so all of these different groups, they're divided. That's what's coming. That is what's here in many places, but it's walking in the door. I don't think we have longer than 3 years. Well, I don't think we have longer than 1 year. I think at the next election, the things that we're pushing back in, if they are not solidly said, no way, there's not going to be any fighting them, because I believe that it's going to completely be pushed through because they know they can.
So I've got 2 questions for you. One on that note, so I'll start there. You'd mentioned something, a couple minutes back about, Black conservatives. Here's one of the problems that I think that we're seeing is this has become politicized, where it's, conservative or Republican, Democrat. It's become so polarized. To me, I see it from, with the Institute of Liberal Values, seeing this as a liberal value, seeing actually diversity and tolerance as a liberal value, that both conservatives and classical liberals, but also progressives. I mean, I think that we've just, again, it's the conversation that's gotten warped. So you spoke as you mentioned conservatism. How do you think that we can have this conversation that speaks? I feel like people will automatically shut you down, label you as conservative. You're not on so all of a sudden you're in the out group. If you start to have these, this is called conservative talking points. To me, this is what I'm fighting against, where I think they're liberal talking points.
Yes.
And to me, classical liberalism spans both progressive and conservative ideology. Is there any idea, what are your thoughts on that? And how can we kind of span that political polarization to have the real conversations about neo-Marxism, which I truly believe if people really knew what was happening, like as we've been discussing, and seeing the roots of it being neo-Marxist, both the progressives and the conservatives would be going, would come together in this way. So how do we have this conversation?
So I believe that's true of the classical liberals and the conservatives. But at progressives, we need to stop pretending that progressive is a leftist term. You can be progressive on both sides.
Mm.
I believe progressives are the biggest danger because they see progress as however they want to define it.
Mm.
And so it doesn't matter that we're going back in time, that race relations are worse today, right now, than I've ever experienced in my lifetime. Now, I wasn't around in the 60s. And like I've said, it's not the 60s, but it's made that way. And it's made that way through policies that say safe spaces for different minorities on campuses. That's no different. It's taking the segregation sign down and moving it to the other side of the room. So they've asked for their own. Our children have been asked our children have been trained to ask for their own enslavement. Flip side of that, I've had amazing conversations with classical liberals. And even just last week, I interviewed a progressive author because I do have a stance on what books are appropriate and what books bring healing. And we had a wonderful conversation. Like we modeled great discourse without having to agree. You have to show them. And that's the problem, that in the progressive kind of college right now, they're being told to not even listen to somebody with a different viewpoint, to
Right.
silence them. So I've been shunned. I've gone to a school to speak about EDI, which is just DEI changed around, but they think we're too dumb to realize it.
There's one called Jedi, and I had to ask,
Yes.
what is that? Like,
Yeah,
oh, because
it's
that sounds
all
cool.
you see the EDI, and I'm like, as soon
Right.
as I see equity, I know you're talking communism.
Right.
So but the kids don't know that.
Right.
The
Right. Well,
kids
that's the
believe
problem.
that they're being taught. So you catch them. So I make videos. That's one way that I do it. I make videos and I just talk about my experience. I talk from a reasonable point. I don't yell and shout at people. I find the common thread if I can. I was able to sit down with she's called the First Lady of the Black Churches of Utah. And we very far Democrat, supposedly, right? On paper or whatever. We were able to sit down and have a conversation. And the way that door came in, it was from doing Harriet, from talking about having the shackles on my arms and on my legs and around my neck and being marched from place to place. And then she had that cognitive disconnect because the progressive reporters and other people have said that I'm, the black face of white supremacy type of things. And so that was her opinion of me.
Mm-hmm.
And then she saw for herself.
Right.
And that's the thing, is we have to show them for ourselves that we're reasonable, that we have the same things. And I sat with her and I said, so what do you think a conservative is? And she was like, well, why don't you tell me? And I said, okay, these are my beliefs. I believe that every single person should be able and free to raise their family the way they see fit to raise their family. I believe we should be able to work and make a living, and maybe even make a good living based on our own merit. I believe our children deserve the best education possible and to never be told that they can't achieve. And she sat there and she goes, agreed, agreed, agreed. And I said, well, congratulations, you are a conservative. So once you remove, the orange man out of the conversation, but also the other thing is that I think you have to do something, because what you're dealing with, and this makes people mad. So I'm going to go there because it's important.
Yeah.
Is that mental slavery, post-traumatic slave syndrome, when you are told over and over and over again that, do you know who Alvin Louis is?
I don't.
Okay. He is the founder of Courage is a Habit.
Okay.
And so I interviewed him and he said, here's the difference. When immigrants come to this country, they think we are one generation away from success and prosperity. Just one more generation forward. He said African Americans are often taught to look backwards. And so you have to teach to look forward. This is why people don't want me to speak, because I'm this foster kid who is an autodidact and who can sit in a room with senators and command the conversation. And they don't like that, because then if I can do it from the worst and hardest of circumstances, because I don't know if you know the ACEs scale, but I'm a 9 on the ACEs scale.
Okay. Now, what is, explain that to for others.
Adverse childhood effects of trauma.
Okay.
So it used to be only 10, but in our kind of very fragile society, I believe that the number is higher. But whatever the number is, the only kind of bad trauma thing is I've never seen someone killed in front of me. Everything else, you can, use your imagination. But the thing is that the narrative that they want to say is that people like me are who they're trying to help. So when I stand up and say, no, you're not, this is not helping, you must teach people who grew up in the worst and hardest situations how to be resilient. That has to be the key. And then, of course, they manipulate the words. So they will say, well, SEL teaches resilience. No, it doesn't. SEL, ethnic studies, they don't teach resilience. They teach anger and activism. That's what they teach. And that's not resilience. And what they mean is able to withstand a colonized society. Because while they say that their whole issue is colonization, and, that's a terrible thing, they're colonizing us right now. They're absolutely colonizing us. They're dividing us into groups. We have, in my small town, they're pulling the Native Americans out of history class. And they're having them go to their own history class. They're colonizing us all over again.
I just made a note, colonization of the mind, because they use colonization as, but I mean, and to me, this is one of the things, and again, I don't mean to do a shameless plug of the book, but it reminds me of my conversation with Wink, because the only way to really have these conversations is to be in community together, and to see, one of our big disagreements, he and I, he's like, when can we see each other as old Americans? And my argument was, we can't, because of exactly the things that you just mentioned, what we're doing. And it was so sad, because I want to see my history as Black history, as Native American history. I mean, my skin color might be a certain tone, but that is my history. Whether the good, the bad, and the ugly, the resilience is my history.
Yes.
And we're doing such a disservice by separating us out that way. And I told Wink that I didn't think we were there. I don't think we are, but that I wish that we were. And before I go too off on that tangent, I want to go back to something that you said, because this is kind of my last question for you. But on, referencing the book again, I told Wink, as I already said, I don't know what it's like to live in the ghetto. Carob, I mean, not that foster home is a ghetto, but you kind of do. What? And like you said, you have a 9 on this, traumatic scale. So what is it about you in particular? Was there a moment in your life? Do you think it's just the way you were, your DNA, the way you were, made? What is it about you that has, because if that oppressor narrative is going to attract anyone, you would think, as what we're being told, that you would be like candidate number 1, So what is it like? How did you get out of that?
Okay, so there's a few things. The first one is in 6th grade. I had a teacher. His name was Mr. Garza. So he's Hispanic. And in 5th grade, a girl had called me the N-word and shouted out that my mother sold coke. And I yelled back at her, no, it's pot. And then I jumped over 2 chairs and I pulled her hair out in 2 giant clumps. And so I had a reputation, because it took teachers to pull me off of her, and people called me Scary Carrie. And it was rough. And so the next year, the teachers drew a lot to decide who was going to have me in their class. And Mr. Garza, within like the first couple of weeks of school, he goes, do you know what I see in you? I see all the potential in the world. You can be anything you want to be. And I know you have a horrible, horrible foster family. It was obvious. So, and he said, but they're not going to be in your life forever. You get to make the decisions for your life. So that's one. Two is in high school, I had a person who I asked, another teacher, who I had said, well, I'm turning 18. Eventually I'll be voting. I don't know anything about that. Who do I vote for? And she said, oh, that's easy. You're Black and you're poor. You're a Democrat. And I thought, I don't want to be poor forever. So that doesn't work for me.
Mhm.
So my politics were nothing, because the third thing is my faith. So I believe, being a child of God, that I am royalty. That's what I believe. I believe that I'm royalty, and I believe I have very simple ideas that I've always had, because when my mother would beat the crap out of me and I would hide, I would get under piles of clothes and I would watch the television, and I'd watch Nick at Night, and I watched Disney cartoons. And it is very annoying that people will say that, Disney cartoons are old fashioned and whatever else, because I'd watch the princesses who would overcome things. And I thought, that's what grace is. That's what I want to do. I watched the people who would be treated like crap and be kind to everyone. And I thought, that's what I want to do. So in my head, I might have a little bit of a princess complex, not gonna lie. but I've never seen it. I've never seen people who are bitter, who are constantly consumed with their resentment.
Mhm.
I've never seen them thrive. Never. Well, even if they thrive and have a lot of money, like ethnic studies advisors, okay? Or yeah, the people who go to the schools and train the teachers on what's correct and what's a microaggression and whatever else. They are miserable people. They're Every post that they make on social media is ugly and looking for the worst in the world.
Mm.
Gross. It doesn't matter if they look beautiful. It doesn't matter. I mean, because they're literally, on average, they're making $100,000 more a year as a DEI trainer than
Mhm.
whatever they started with. And that's here in Utah. Like I've looked up their numbers and I'm like, wow, 34,000 to 142. That's interesting. but they're miserable people. And I would rather be a light. And that's why I fight, because I see so many children. I see the light in so many children, right? And they want to snuff that light out to use them as pawns. And that is really, it's abusive. It's abusive to strip their hope and to turn kids who don't care. I was once in Seattle and I was holding a sign that said reject CRT, they are using us, and it had a pawn on it. And a van full of teenagers drove by and they said, can I see what your sign says? I was afraid because teenagers are losing their minds. And I turned my sign and this girl goes, that we never cared until they told us we had to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. Well, we both are mothers, and I think one
Yeah.
of the things that drives both of us is the love of our children. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes when I feel like we can't beat this monster, I go and sub at my local charter school, or even just I go and play recess with the kids that I was their para, or their para educator before, just so that I can remember that this is why we do it and we don't stop.
Well, on that note, I'm going to stop this podcast here, knowing that you and I are going to have this conversation on your platform and probably several other times on this platform. It's just getting to know you and your story and what's happening in Utah has been such a joy, Carrie. I'm honored to have you in my life and in my orbit. So thank you.
My pleasure. I'm so glad to have been introduced to you.
Same.